사랑하는 나의 마음을 주께서 아시나이다. 주 나의 하나님이여 주를 경배합니다. 주 사랑하는 나의 마음을 주께서 아시나이다. 나의 주 나의 하나님이여 주를 경배합니다. 주 사랑하는 나의 마음을 주께서 아시나이다.
진실하게 거룩하게 살게 하소서. 진실하게 거룩하게 살게 하소서. 진실하게 거룩하게
네, good morning. 오늘 아침 찬송 305장 같이 부르겠습니다. This morning we'll be singing hymn number 305. 나 같은 죄인 살리신 주 안에 나와 잃었던 생명 찾아고 광명을 얻었네. 근죄악에서 건지신 주 은혜 고마워. 나 처음 믿는 그 시간 귀하고 귀하다. 이제껏 내가 산 것도 주님의 은혜다. 오나들 자모 향해 인도해 주시니 거기서 우리 영원히 주님의 은혜도 해처럼 밖에 살면서 주 찬양하리라. 아멘. 네, 오늘 아침 말씀은 에스라 4장 1절부터 10절 같이 보겠습니다. This morning we'll be looking at the book of Ezra, chapter 4, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 10 this morning. And I'll read this for us today. It says, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, you have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us. Then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Bishlam, Merethidas, Tabeel, and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Aramaic script and in the Aramaic language. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes, the king, as follows. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, and administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk and Babylon, the Elamites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashurnibal deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in Trans-Euphrates. And so this morning we'll be looking at the first passage of Ezra chapter 4 and what happens when the tribes of Judah and Benjamin begin to rebuild the temple. To review a little bit, in chapter 1, we saw how King Cyrus of Persia allowed and helped the exiled Israelites return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. In chapter 2, we are given a list of those who were exiled since Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Then in chapter 3, it talks about the rebuilding of the altar and how sacrifices were made and the foundations of the temple were put in place. And so now here in chapter 4, and continuing on the later chapters, we will see how there will begin to be much opposition and resistance against the rebuilding of the temple as well as the entire city of Jerusalem. And so there's much that we can learn today, not only from how to deal with opposition, but also what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And so point number 1 for this morning is that people may have bad intentions when offering help or advice, but God always wants what is best for us. Once again, people may have bad intentions when offering help or advice, but God always wants what is best for us. 사람들은 도움이나 조언을 할 때 나쁜 의도를 가질 수 있지만 주님은 항상 우리에게 가장 좋은 것을 원한다. And so we see in verse 1 that the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that they were rebuilding the temple. So in verse 2, they come to talk to Zerubbabel and the heads of the family and ask if they could help build the temple. They say that they have been worshiping and making sacrifices to the same God ever since the king of Assyria brought them there. Some of you might be confused thinking at this point, why are these people considered enemies or adversaries, since aren't they just offering help to rebuild? Based on the history of the exile and what is even written in the Bible, many scholars believe that this was the early beginnings of what would later be known as the Samaritans in the New Testament. This is the popular belief since although the majority of the Israelites were taken captive by first King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and then they were all taken captive by the Persian Empire, there were still some who remained behind. And as it says here in verse 2, some of those were under the rule of Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who allowed them to come back to Jerusalem and to the surrounding area as well. People would always be looked down upon and considered second-class half-breed citizens. Since Zerubbabel and the Levites and the leaders of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin knew this, they were very cautious when these people came offering their help. Did they really just want to help, or did they have some kind of secret, hidden agenda? The reason why it is so hard to believe that these people simply wanted to help is since if they really did believe in the one same true God that they said, how could they worship other gods as well as intermarry when it was prohibited by the law? This leads to the common belief that they only wanted to help and be part of the building of the temple for a couple of reasons. Number 1, they wanted to sabotage, ruin, and prevent the rebuilding of the temple. Or number 2, they wanted to have some kind of influence and perhaps make some changes to the new temple from how it would be used, such as including places for other gods, for other places of worship for other gods. Some of you may be wondering where we get all that information from, as it is quite evident when you see how the people respond when the tribe of Judah and Benjamin and the Levites reject their help. We will get more to it in the next 2 points and even in tomorrow's morning devotion. But we see that starting in verse 4, that when their help is rejected, they start going around in order to prevent the temple from being built. They discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to keep building in verse 4. they bribed officials to work against and frustrate the rebuilding plans in verse 5. And in verse 6, they start a formal accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. If these people really did believe in God and had the right intention, then why did they act like this? On top of that, wouldn't it be easier for them to let the tribe of Judah and Benjamin and the Levites build the temple themselves? They must have had a reason why they wanted to be so involved in part of the planning and rebuilding of the temple. So that is just a reminder for us today that even in the beginning, people may seem friendly and are offering all sorts of advice and help. But we must be careful to discern and see if there is some other kind of motive. Is the help being offered genuine and sincere, or is it deceiving and manipulative? And in the end, both sides will get what they justly deserve, since God knows if we are the ones being tricked or if we are the ones tricking and lying to others. And this leads to my second point for this morning, is that believers should be unified when standing up and fighting for what is right. Once again, believers should be unified when standing up and fighting for what is right. 올바른 것을 위해 이렇게 싸울 때 교인들은 다 교대해야 한다. So we see in verse 3 that Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel denied the request for the people's help. They say that the ones who offered their help will have no part with us in building the temple to God, and that it will only be the tribes of Israel themselves who will build the temple. This is the same kind of unified mindset that believers should have when it comes to standing firm for our faith and belief in God. It probably would have been convenient and easier getting help from all these people to rebuild the temple, but they did not want to compromise what they believed in. Unfortunately, there are many people today who do end up compromising their faith in exchange for convenience or even to be better liked by people. Zerubbabel, the Levites, and the tribe of Judah and Benjamin probably had a good idea what was going to happen to them by saying no to all these people offering help. They could have easily prevented all the trouble that is going to come in the next couple of chapters by simply accepting their help and advice. But they knew that they would not only be compromising their belief, but also potentially tainting the temple of God. Since, as mentioned earlier, these people said they worship the same one true God, but they are yet still worshiping other gods and even breaking many of the Old Testament laws. Similarly, today, there are many of those different kinds of laws and propositions that are trying to be passed in our country and state and local government. And some of them do threaten not only our freedom of religion, but also what it means to be a believer and follower of God. Yet there are many people out there who are somewhat afraid to make a strong biblical stance for what they believe in due to the pressure and hatred that they may receive from other people, including family and friends. In order to keep the peace, we may end up making some compromises here and there. And these compromises do not only take place on an individual level, but even beyond, at the family level, a church level, a denominational level, a county level, a state level, and even as an entire country. Because so many people are so concerned about their own well-being and welfare, it is getting harder and harder to become unified. That is something that both Jesus and the apostle warned us about, how we ought to be unified as Christ's body and remember that Jesus is at the head. Instead of working together and standing up for bigger and better causes, many believers end up arguing among themselves. And that is exactly what Satan wants, since it is somewhat easier to stand up unified against a common outside enemy, such as the tribes of Judah and Benjamin did today, which is why he wants to try to break us from the inside out. By being so focused on arguing and pointing fingers at each other, churches, denominations, and even Christians as a whole are losing sight of the real fight. So I pray and hope that starting today, that all of us here would be able to become more unified for standing up for what is right, even if it means making the hard decision. We are not living in this world to be liked by people, but we are living to bring God glory. And that brings us to our last point for this morning. Point number 3 is that we should not be surprised when enemies prevent you from doing good, even if it's legal and allowed. Once again, do not be surprised when enemies prevent you from doing good, even if it's legal and allowed. 적들이 성행을 방해하더라도 그게 합법적이라고 해도 놀라지 마라. We see in verse 3 that Zerubbabel, the Levites, and the tribes of Benjamin and Judah had gotten permission earlier in chapter 1 by King Cyrus to rebuild the temple. They were not doing anything illegal or wrong here, and were simply doing God's work by rebuilding the altar and the temple. But despite all that, the people in the area started giving them a very hard time, as we mentioned earlier. In verses 4 to 6, they started doing anything in their power to prevent the rebuilding of the temple. They probably made threats to the people building and probably even physically sabotaged and vandalized the temple as it was being built. Not only that, but they had bribed the local authorities and officials who, although were under the jurisdiction of King Cyrus, started to make things difficult for the rebuilding. They were able to do so since it would take a decent amount of time to make an official report or complaint directly to King Cyrus. On top of that, the officials could easily lie and make up reports as they were being bribed and paid off. And as if this was not already enough, the people even then began to write a formal letter of complaint and accusations against the tribes of Israel, which we will get to more tomorrow morning. This just shows that not only back then, but even today, that even though we may be doing what is right and what we are supposed to do, that not everything will work out smoothly. These things can happen in our own homes, as we may have issues with our spouses, our parents, our children, our siblings. This can also happen at our workplaces and even here at church, and even as we are just living everyday normal life in society. Even as we do things with the right heart and the right intentions, there will still be people who, for whatever reason, will try to bring you down and prevent you from doing what you are supposed to be doing. We may think that we have all the right and all the support to do what we are supposed to do, but there will always be naysayers and those who are against us. And this is exactly what Jesus warns us about in the Gospels, that the world and Satan will always be at odds and against us. And if they were willing and able to put Jesus on trial and kill him, someone who is not only the Son of God, but was 100% innocent, then they will try to do the same to all his followers as well. So let us not become discouraged from doing what is good and right in God's eyes, no matter how much pushback and hatred we may get from people around us. As Paul says, we must fight the good fight and run the race until the very end. So let us live our lives with our words and actions as if we were doing them before the Lord and not simply in front of people. And so, conclusion for this morning, let us remember that people may have bad or hidden intentions when offering help or advice, but God always wants what is best for us. Let us also remember that believers should be unified when standing up and fighting for what is right. Lastly, let us remember to not be surprised when the enemy prevents you from doing good, even if it's legal and allowed. And so at this time, if you can reflect on this morning's word, if you can also pray and spend some time in prayer, let us spend some time in prayer.